I'm also going to talk about values, but on a different level. I will bring these values down from international and European level to national level. And I'm going to talk about how committing to these liberal democratic values helped Estonia to become an independent country and a sort of full member of European and international community. And I was asked to share the experiences that are worth sharing and that helped our society to get so far. And I have chosen to talk about Estonia's identity through the prism of security, because I have been working in the realm of security for a long time, and security today is or has become such a big part of our identity construction, so it would be sort of wrong not to have this as a starting point. And this is especially a sensitive question when it comes to small countries, because it has a lot to do with values. And I mean, a small country cannot protect its values without connecting to any of the bigger communities who help to protect these values. So my starting point and my question is whether identity can be secured. And first of all, we have to make sure what kind of identity we are talking about. I'm not talking about personal identity or ethnic identity. I'm talking about national identity as a basis for a national state. And this has nothing to do with nationalism in itself, as we understand it today in a negative sense. I think when Estonia started to recreate its state in the beginning of the 90s, then nation building was a very, very important process and part of the whole thing, because coming from the Soviet Union, you had to recreate your identity as Estonia. So again, I mean, is identity an end state or is it a process? It's certainly a process because it is changing constantly. And sometimes we want to get rid of some of our past to be able to recreate a new identity or become innovative in our identity building. But there are other parts of identity which we want to preserve and protect, because this is what helps us to feel secure as a state, as a person. The first post-Soviet president of Estonia, Lennart, Meri, said that security is like virginity. You are either a virgin or you're not. You are either secure or you are not secure. I think that this, I've been thinking a lot about this quotation, and I think that this was a very good quotation to characterize the times of the 1990s, when it was very clear that when we talked about security, we talked about territorial integrity and national security. It may not be that relevant today anymore, because, I mean, no state can be secure completely and in all terms. There are so many components to security today that we can't even foresee, and our identity is changing as well. at least part of it. So may the identity of the source of security change, and also sources of insecurities change in time. And all this is a challenge to our self-image and to the picture of ourselves we want to believe in. So how Estonia is perceived in the West and in the East, and what image do you have of this country? I know that you come from very diverse and different regions in Russia, and I don't know how much you know about Estonia or how much you have ever thought about Estonia. Probably you thought about it a little bit more when we were part of the Soviet Union, but how much you know about Estonia today? And I mean, is this a Baltic country or a former Soviet republic or a success story of the post-Soviet space? Or do you think of this as one of the most modern and digitalized countries in the world? Or a member of the European Union? Or maybe you think of Estonia as a small, paranoid country full of Russophobes and xenophobes. Or you think about it as a small country with pure nature and introvert people. Or as some Kremlin officials have said, this is not a proper country at all. So it is very much up to you how you defined Estonia. But we, as Estonians, we identify us as a Finno-Ugric nation living on the shores of the Baltic Sea. And today we think that we have our own very distinctive language and culture, but we are still part of the Western cultural space. And yes, we think that we are the most modern, liberal and digitalized country, at least in this part of the world. Because I think Estonia is one, if not the only country who has adopted the digital government approach, which means that there is a communication between a state and citizens in a digital world. So we do everything digitally when we need to connect to the state. All state services come to us through this little screen. And this is a sort of futuristic way of living, but it is based on the trust between its citizens and the state. So, since Estonia regained its independence in the 1990s, the country has been securing its identity. And I'm going to mention three aspects what to my mind made this possible. The first one was a very strong sense of self. A lot of dreaming and hard work during the Soviet years. Strong ethnic and linguistic identity helped to shape cultural identity during a very long time under foreign rule. You may know from history that Estonia and also the other Baltic states, maybe, well, Lithuania has had a different path, but Estonia and Latvia have followed the same sort of route for a long time, that we have been under the foreign rule for more than 700 years. And we still have preserved our own culture, and we have built up our own nation state. The German order and the Baltic German nobility, but also Swedish, Danish, Polish, Tsarist, Russian and Soviet rule have been above us. But language has always been considered as a basis for Estonian national identity, and our almost paganist culture and belief system were used very much as tools of protest against the foreign rulers. So it has always been a strong spirit of resistance. And even during the Soviet time, it was Estonian cultural elite who published underground in Estonian language. And it was the humor and literature and everything else that expressed that resistance to the Soviet rule, and that kept that sort of a dream of independence alive during the Soviet time. So another thing is that Estonia is situated on the border of two civilizations, the West and the East. And sometimes people ask us that what makes you think that you belong to the Western cultural space, as you could as well belong to the Eastern or Slavic cultural space. But this is not the case, because it has been the Germanic sort of cultural space that has dominated our region for all these hundreds of years. And the christening of the Baltic countries in the 12th and 13th century, the influence of German culture, and during hundreds of years, and the establishment of the Tartu University by the Swedish king Gustav Adolf II in 1632 laid the basis for Estonia's belonging to the Western cultural space. Actually, it was the German nobility who endorsed and encouraged Estonian peasants to write down their own history and tell their own story. They did it for us before that, and then they educated the Estonian peasants to do that themselves and write it down in the Estonian language. So there are also things we have to be grateful for. And of course, another thing what helped us in the beginning of the 90s was the experience of independence that we had during 1918 and 1941, that raised our self-esteem and sort of assured that we were able to function as a nation. So the national awakening started in Estonia, as in many other European countries, towards the end of the 19th century. And the turbulent events of the beginning of the 20th century, the World War I, Russian Revolution, led Estonia to its first period of independence. It was not a result of an agreement of the Europe's great powers. It was rather a coincidence of favorable factors. Weakness of Russia and Germany after the First World War, the activities of Estonian national movement, and the spread of Wilsonian concept of internationalism, nationalism, and self-determination. So Estonia's main problem between the first period of independence was exactly how to guarantee the security of this nation state without either the protection of any great power. We had neither Germany nor Russia or Soviet Union at our sides. And in a way we were very happy about that, but we still needed allies who could help us to maintain that independence and adequate self-defense capability. There was no ideal solution, but despite that, Estonia became full functioning and successful democratic state for 20 years. So as you know, Estonia lost its independence like the other Baltic states as a result of the secret protocol of Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939. And the end of the Second World War and the following 50 years of Soviet occupation and oppressive and dramatic nationalist policies contributed to the survival of the spirit of freedom and dream of independence. So anti-Soviet movement among the intellectuals cultural literature, survival of political opposition, civic activism of people made it possible to take the opportunity when it opened up and redeclared its independence in 1991. So the spirit of independence was there all the time. And when the situation changed in the Soviet Union towards the end of the 1980s, then Estonians took the chance and started a huge civic movement towards freedom. The Singing Revolution and the Baltic chain that was 600 kilometers long from Tallinn to Vilnius. And we believed that we belonged in Europe and we wanted to return to Europe from this Soviet space. So when a small state becomes independent and it is bordering with a great and relatively aggressive power, then we, of course, needed to protect our statehood and independence. And security became immensely important, and securitization can become, or became, a dominant mechanism of identity formation. For Estonia, the object of securitization has always been national independence and territorial integrity. Russia was obviously a source of threat to Estonia's independence, and we were eager to identify us with everything that would take us away from our Soviet past and closer to the West. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Estonia had three security policy options. The first was neutrality, following the Finnish model. The other one was tight connections with the former Soviet countries, the CIS countries. And the third option was integration into the Western economic and security structures. But it became clear very early on that the only viable security guarantee could come from the West, through gradual integration into NATO and the EU. Liberal democratic values and value-based and rule-based institutions could be the only protection of our independence. At that time, Estonia had sort of no membership perspective. Nobody ever promised us anything. So we had a lot of negotiations with Brussels and Washington. And to be honest, officials in Pentagon or even Bundestag or whatever European capital, they were laughing at our aspirations of becoming a member of the European Union or NATO. They thought that this would be a very, very bad idea because this would upset Russia, and they were not ready to face the consequences of that. But time changed, and especially in the beginning of 2000, when Russia started to sort of build up its self-esteem and got richer and better off on oil money, and President Putin had sort of a solid ground under his feet, it became quite clear that the security of the Baltic states cannot be left hanging in the air. And we were accepted as members of European Union and NATO in 2004, the 1st of May. But all that, I think, what made Estonia's way towards these organizations and Europeanization possible was that our government had the right rhetoric from the very first steps. Our president, Lennart Meri, never talked about any benefits, sort of financial benefits or any other illusions of what we would gain from Europe or by returning to Europe. He talked about values. He talked about our rightful place in Europe and in European cultural space. And he always emphasized that even if we become members, it is not about us getting protection. It is as much about our own contribution to these institutions, and it's as much about our own commitments to these values. So we have to play along on all stages, whatever it takes. And actually, this helped a lot. And even without these membership perspectives, Estonian ministries and officials worked very, very hard, and even the civic society, towards a goal that we didn't know would be membership. So we reformed our institutions already very early in the 90s. And another very important step towards this direction was that the young people and the youth were engaged in these institution building processes from the start. All this old nomenclatura was changed out. I started to work at the MFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, when I was 18 years old. And I have studied and worked in parallel during all these years, because this was the only way to learn. Nobody knew how to build up a state or how to be a country. So we were basically children doing this. And our first, foreign minister was 25-year-old. And people in Brussels were always complaining why Estonia and the Baltic states are sending these children to negotiation tables. But these were the only people we had at that time. And I think that this also helped to maintain some sort of fresh mentality and change the mindset from this Soviet to a more sort of liberal democratic and free mindset. So if we then go ahead and say that, are we today secure enough in Estonia? The answer is yes and no. In a way, yes, we feel secure because we are one of the most integrated countries in Europe. We belong to any organization there is to belong to, I think, starting from NATO, EU, OECD, WTO, all these, we belong to Eurozone, and also all these regional organizations. But at the same time, we also have to think about the new challenges that we are facing. 1990s was still quite a clear sort of situation. Everybody was hoping for a world to become a very peaceful place after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This did not turn out to be the case. So we see thanks to Kremlin's actions in Georgia 2008, thanks to annexation of Crimea 2014, small countries, I think, had every reason to be very worried about their own security situation. And Russia has never been very graceful with its rhetoric towards the Baltic countries. We have never had normal diplomatic relationships, unfortunately, between Tallinn and Moscow. There has never been any state-level visits to each other's countries. And this is not the reason. The reason is not that we do not want that. We want that, but it has to be a two-way traffic. Dialogue needs two sides. And if Kremlin and Russian establishment has chosen to keep this dialogue with European Union and the US rather than the Baltic countries, then it is their decision, and we cannot do much about that. But of course, Russia is not the only challenge we have. It's also the financial crisis, and in Europe, still we feel some traces of it. And the world is in the mess as you look around. There are divisions within the European Union about different issues. There are divisions between Europe and the US. Europe has taken several decisions on their own which go against President Trump's vision of how the world should be. There is no unity. So I think that our former president, Toomas Hendrik Ilves, was right when he said that the path that took us here takes us no further. So we need to find new ways of how to approach these questions, how to talk to people, how to talk to countries. And the stability of alliances and organizations where states seek their security guarantees depends on the equal commitments of all the allies. These fading commitments and national caveats set by other members and allies may themselves be a cause of instability and insecurity. So we have many other challenges. Now in the previous session, the digital challenges were taken up, cyber attacks, disinformation campaign. But for me, one of the main concerns is the alienation of our youth from the political processes. The amount of disinformation that they get through social media, through mainstream media, this sort of pacifies them. They do not want to participate in this anymore because they do not believe in anybody anymore. And this is a real threat. How are you going to engage them? How are you going to make or convince them in believing in the better future if they do not care about the future anymore? And if young people ultimately do not share the values that glue institutions together and unify countries with distinct national identities, then the outlook of the next 100 years will be pretty bleak. So that kind of civic activism and awareness raising is of paramount importance. Or as we just had this conference in Tallinn, where we also talk about Russia. These were Russian experts talking about Russia, and something I remembered from this was that historically Russia has been unprepared for fast-paced political change, and therefore it's crucial to work with and train the youth to reshape a Russia you want to live in the future. I mean, this is pretty much in your hand, and at the end of the day it boils down to the question, what kind of life you want to live and what kind of future you want for your children. Do you want to live in a world where you can say what you want, you can think what you want, you can travel where you want? Or if you just think of the survival in a society in a sort of most comfortable way and not opposing too much, not making too much trouble. This is a way of living too. But do you want this? It's up to you. So I will finish here.